The massive illiteracy crisis in our country is costing us trillions of dollars. It's destroying countless lives. This is not some partisan thing, right? It doesn't matter what political party you're from. It doesn't matter what your religion is. We all, I think, should agree that people ought to know how to read. And it's so simple. Half of American adults are basically illiterate. Folks, how did this happen? It's a monumental crime against our country, against our people. For hundreds of years, leading up to when this crisis began, parents were teaching their kids to read at home very, very simply. So what happened? Did we just forget how to teach reading? There is a long history there. And I submit to you, and I believe we will prove, that this was deliberate. So we'll start with a guy called Horace Mann. Horace Mann. He's often called the father of public education in America. Back in the 1830s, he was appointed as Secretary of Education, the first Secretary of Education any state had ever had. He was very impressed with the Prussian system. One of the big reforms that he introduced was a new method of teaching reading. He promoted this idea called the whole word method of teaching reading. And he started with this experiment in the public schools of Boston. It was a total disaster, as we will see. But it begins with a new way of thinking about reading, right? So if you know how to read, you understand that each letter in our phonetic alphabet represents one or more sounds. This is very simple, right? An A represents an or an E sound. A B is a B sound. A C could be a K sound, depending on the context. So each letter represents a sound. And when you combine those sounds together, you can read essentially any word in front of you. So fish, you got a F, I, and then SH together makes a sh sound, so you got fish. Right? Now, Horace Mann thought, let's try something different. He said, let's teach these children to memorize the whole word, as if it was like Chinese, right? Where instead of letters, each one representing a sound, you have a symbol that represents a word, a concept, or an idea. So instead of sounding out fish, you would look at an F, an I, an S, and an H and say, that's a nice symbol there. That means fish. And of course, that doesn't inherently mean fish. It's a collection of symbols, each one representing a sound. So let's go back in time a little bit further. Even before Horace Mann tried this out in the public schools in Boston, there was a very kind reverend. His name was Reverend Thomas Gallaudet, and he was the head of what they used to call the Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb. This was in Hartford, Connecticut, and this was a very special school. And the thinking that Reverend Gallaudet had was, look, these children, they're just as smart as anybody else, but of course they can't learn to read, because how do you teach a child that a P makes a P sound when a child can't hear the P sound? So he said, well, what if we teach the kids how to memorize the whole word? This idea was revolutionary for these deaf children, because instead of having to sound out the words, which was of course impossible when they couldn't hear the sounds, they could now memorize words. And really, really smart kids can memorize hundreds, maybe even thousands of words. And so suddenly, the written word became at least partially accessible to these deaf children who can't speak. So that was an incredible advancement for these children at the Hartford Asylum. But what happened when Horace Mann tried it out on the non-deaf children in the government schools he was establishing in Boston was a total disaster. In 1844, dozens of Boston schoolmasters from these new public schools got together and they published a blistering critique of this whole thing. The Boston schoolmasters said this in their critique, that this new method, this change proposed by Mr. Mann and others, is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning. That's a really diplomatic way of saying, you idiot! The children aren't learning how to read. The children were showing signs of what today we often label dyslexia, right? They were reading the words backwards. They couldn't read. If they came to a word that they had not memorized, it just didn't make sense. It looked like gobbledygook. And so very, very quickly in Boston, at least within a few years, they stopped because this didn't work. And even among the kids who were super brilliant and could memorize thousands of words, they still hated reading. What do you do when you come to a word that you haven't memorized? And of course, you just have to guess. Nowadays, they use your word attack skills and attack the word and look for context clues and look for pictures. And what? This is not reading. And again, for deaf children, wonderful, wonderful work that Reverend Gallaudet did. This was a great advancement for these children. But why use this on non-deaf children? And so thanks to these Boston schoolmasters, this quackery, as I like to call it, was buried and almost forgotten for almost 50 years. This idea ended up getting picked up by a very nefarious individual, the other founder of public schools, John Dewey. Now, John Dewey, and all across this country, we have schools named Horace Mann Elementary. We've got John Dewey Middle School. So these are huge, towering figures in the history of American education. John Dewey, of course, was a socialist. He went to the Soviet Union. He loved that. And he wanted to fundamentally transform America. He really didn't like the kind of Christian free system that existed, and he wanted to replace it. One of the things that he did, he wanted to establish a new system of education. He wanted to fundamentally transform education. He had a radically different vision of education. And in an essay that he published, this was in 1898, even before he was well known, it was called The Primary Education Fetish. He revealed something very, very profound. He said this, and I'm quoting, he said, "Change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction." This is really profound, folks. He understood, and if you read the essays, like, we don't need to teach these little kids how to read, write, and do math. What we really need to teach them is to be good little collectivists, to understand that they're part of the community. You know, the other stuff will just come naturally later. He understood that dumbing down the children would be a good idea. So he teams up just some years later with John D. Rockefeller. Yes, that John D. Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest individuals to ever exist in the history of humanity, the oil man. They used to call him a robber baron. Rockefeller and Dewey did not see eye to eye on where they wanted society to go, right? Rockefeller was interested in making a lot of money and snuffing out his competition and just being as wealthy as he could be. But he was getting a very bad name for himself, and so one of the things that his buddies suggested to him was, well, why don't you start donating money to charity, to philanthropy? So one of the philanthropies that they set up was called the General Education Board. And this General Education Board, run by a guy called Frederick Gates, who thought children should yield themselves with perfect docility to their molding hands. And he was very open about, we don't need more artists and philosophers and statesmen and scientists. We got plenty of those, right? We don't need poets. What we really need are dumbed-down worker drones, for lack of a better term, right? We just need people who will turn the screw when they're told and know enough to do that, but not ask a whole bunch of questions and philosophize and all the rest of it. So Dewey and Rockefeller come together with very different visions of where this should go over the long term, but united on their idea that education needs to change. John Dewey, with $3.1 million in funding from John D. Rockefeller through the General Education Board, sets up an experimental school at the University of Chicago. And so they try out these new ideas, including the resurrection of the whole word method of teaching reading. They graduated a bunch of kids from this school, and it didn't take long before it was obvious that these children could not read, could not write, could not do math. And instead of saying, oh, what have we done here? This is crazy, they said, aha, this will be perfect for the whole country. One of the victims of this, incidentally, was one of Rockefeller's children, who wrote in his own autobiography about how he was unable to read because of this quackery. Now, fortunately for him, he was so wealthy, he didn't need to read. He had an army of secretaries and assistants and executive aides and all the rest of it. They could read all of his correspondence for him and type out or write whatever needed to be written. So for Rockefeller, the handicap wasn't debilitating. For a normal person who can't afford a secretary to handle their mail, this turns out to be catastrophic, of course. Fast forward a little more, and John Dewey moves over from the University of Chicago, which is a very, very important position there, and he moves over to Teachers College at Columbia University, which is, to this day, the most important teachers' college of education in the world. Right? This is like the epicenter of the quackery. And Dewey gets a bunch of disciples, and he starts working with a bunch of psychologists and educators and philosophers, and they come up with this new program to totally change how reading is taught all over the United States. So they come up with the Dick and Jane series from the University of Chicago, and then you get the Macmillan Reading Program at Teachers College. And some of you who are watching me right now, you may remember this stuff from when you were a kid, right? One of the really, really big programs that was used for decades in this country, the Dick and Jane series. You've got very, very clear whole word memorizing of words. Right? Now they call it the sight method, the look-say method. You got run, spot, run, run. Oh, funny, spot. So this is designed to get the children to memorize the words instead of learn how to read. Thank you for watching this report, folks. There's so much more that I'd love to dive into, but we can't, unfortunately, because we've got huge censorship from the big tech companies. So if you want to explore this topic further, check out this report and my entire library of uncensored content over at Unifyd.tv. It's linked right below. Membership in Unifyd is going to give you unlimited access to hundreds of uncensored podcasts, investigative journalism, documentaries, films, and content that at one time was available on major streaming platforms like Netflix, but now is basically banned from the internet. So for just $14.99 a month, that's less than $1 a day, you're going to get access to all of it, and your subscription also helps keep the platform running free from censorship and corporate influence. So please consider supporting us and enjoy all of our unfiltered, thought-provoking content in return.